Los Angeles, the 1970s. Hollywood thought it had discovered a movie star. Chuck Norris knew it had discovered something much more dangerous: Bruce Lee. To the world, Bruce was becoming famous for his speed, his punches, his kicks, the way he could move before an opponent even seemed ready. People watched him on screen and thought they were watching a martial arts master, but Chuck Norris had seen something the cameras could never capture. He had seen Bruce Lee when nobody was watching. No audience, no music, no dramatic lighting, no movie script, just a training room and a man who refused to believe he was finished improving. That was the Bruce Lee Chuck Norris respected. And the truth was simple. Bruce Lee wasn't obsessed with winning fights. He was obsessed with understanding them, and that difference would change everything. There was a time when Bruce Lee wasn't yet the worldwide icon people know today. He was still fighting for recognition, still proving himself, still trying to convince Hollywood that an Asian martial artist could become more than a supporting character. But while Hollywood was deciding whether Bruce belonged on the screen, Bruce was building something far more important. He was building himself. Every morning, every afternoon, every night, he trained. Not because someone told him to, not because a camera was waiting, but because he believed that every weakness left inside him could eventually become the reason he lost. That thought followed him everywhere, and Chuck Norris noticed. Chuck Norris understood martial arts from a completely different world. He knew competition, he knew pressure, he knew what it felt like to face an opponent who genuinely wanted to beat you. He understood timing, power, distance, discipline. He had spent years turning technique into instinct. So when he watched Bruce Lee, he wasn't watching him like a movie fan. He was watching him like a fighter. And fighters notice things ordinary people don't. They notice balance. They notice breathing. They notice footwork. They notice hesitation. They notice where a person's eyes go before the body moves. And Bruce gave Chuck plenty to notice. But there was one thing Chuck couldn't ignore. Bruce was always thinking. Even while moving, even while attacking, even while defending, his mind never seemed to stop. Bruce would perform a movement, then stop, think, change it, perform it again, then change it again, not because the first version was necessarily wrong, because Bruce believed there might be a better version, faster, cleaner, more direct, more practical. He wasn't interested in collecting beautiful techniques. He wanted techniques that survived reality. And reality was brutal. An opponent wouldn't stand still. An opponent wouldn't follow a predetermined sequence. An opponent wouldn't politely give you the perfect distance. A real opponent would interrupt, adapt, attack, change direction. And Bruce wanted to be ready for that moment. That was why he questioned everything. He would look at a technique and ask, why? Why this stance? Why this movement? Why this angle? Why waste two motions when one would work? Why follow a rule if the situation doesn't require it? Those questions made Bruce different, and sometimes they made him controversial, because Bruce wasn't afraid to challenge traditions that other people treated as untouchable. He didn't believe martial artists should become prisoners of their styles. To Bruce, a style was a tool, nothing more. If karate had something useful, take it. If boxing had something useful, take it. If fencing had something useful, take it. If kung fu had something useful, take it. But don't worship the label. Test the technique. Keep what works. Discard what doesn't. Then improve what remains. That philosophy would eventually become closely associated with Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do. But Chuck Norris was seeing the philosophy before the world knew what to call it, and that mattered, because Chuck wasn't hearing Bruce explain some theory from a book. He was watching Bruce live it every single day. There was something almost unsettling about Bruce's training. He didn't seem satisfied, ever. A normal person might perform something successfully and feel proud. Bruce would perform it and immediately search for the mistake. Maybe his foot had landed slightly too far. Maybe his shoulder had moved before his hand. Maybe the distance had been wrong. Maybe he had wasted a fraction of a second. That fraction mattered to Bruce, because Bruce understood something most people didn't. In a real fight, fractions of a second become everything. A tiny hesitation can become a missed opportunity. A missed opportunity can become a hit, and one hit can change the entire fight. So Bruce trained his body to move quickly, but he trained his mind to recognize the moment even faster. That was the real secret. His speed wasn't just physical, it was mental. Chuck began noticing another unusual quality. Bruce didn't want to predict exactly what an opponent would do. He wanted to be prepared for whatever happened. That was different. Prediction can fail. Adaptation doesn't have to. If the opponent moved left, Bruce could change. If the opponent moved right, Bruce could change. If the distance disappeared, Bruce could change. If the original plan stopped working, Bruce would abandon the plan. That was the key. Bruce wasn't trying to force the fight to obey him. He was trying to become flexible enough to respond to the fight itself. And Chuck understood the danger of that, because a fighter who has only one answer can eventually be solved. But a fighter who keeps changing the question is much harder to defeat. One day, while the two men were training, Chuck saw that philosophy up close. There were no cameras, no reporters, no screaming fans, just movement. Bruce attacked. Chuck responded. Bruce adjusted. Chuck adjusted again. The pace changed, then changed again. And suddenly Chuck realized that Bruce wasn't simply testing his technique. He was studying him, his rhythm, his reactions, his timing, his habits. Bruce was gathering information. Every movement told him something. Every reaction became another piece of the puzzle. And once Bruce understood a pattern, he changed his own approach. Chuck had fought enough serious opponents to recognize what was happening. Bruce was learning in real time. That was dangerous, very dangerous, because the longer Bruce understood you, the harder you became to surprise him. But Bruce wasn't trying to prove that he was unbeatable. That wasn't the point. In fact, one of the reasons Chuck respected him was because Bruce seemed painfully aware of his own weaknesses. He knew where he was vulnerable. He knew what he didn't understand. And instead of hiding those weaknesses, he attacked them. He trained them, he studied them, he tried to eliminate them. That was a completely different mindset from someone who simply wanted to look like a champion. Bruce wanted to become better, even when nobody was there to applaud. And perhaps that was the most important lesson Chuck learned from him. Talent can attract attention, fame can attract crowds, but discipline creates something else. It creates a person who doesn't need anyone watching. Cool. Then Bruce's life began changing. Hollywood finally started paying attention. The cameras came, the producers came, the opportunities came, and Bruce Lee became a star. Millions would soon watch him perform impossible-looking movements on the screen. They would cheer. They would imitate him. They would talk about his speed. They would talk about his physique. They would talk about his famous 1-inch punch. They would talk about everything they could see, but almost nobody would understand what had happened before the cameras arrived. The years of questioning, the endless repetition, the failures, the experiments, the obsession with efficiency, the refusal to become trapped inside one system. Chuck Norris knew all of that, and that's why his view of Bruce was different. To the audience, Bruce Lee was a movie star who knew kung fu. To Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee was a fighter who happened to become a movie star, and that distinction was enormous. Then came the call. Bruce had a new film, and he wanted Chuck Norris, not as a friend standing in the background, not as a simple cameo. Bruce wanted Chuck to play his opponent. The two men would meet on screen. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary movie fight. Bruce wanted something that felt different, something audiences hadn't seen before. Something that would make people forget they were watching actors. The location was Rome, the setting, the ancient coliseum. And inside that legendary arena, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris would finally face each other. Two martial artists, two philosophies, two very different bodies, Two completely different approaches, and one fight that would become legendary. But before the cameras rolled, before the first strike, before the world saw what happened, Chuck Norris already understood something the audience didn't. He wasn't walking into that scene to fight a helpless opponent. He was standing across from a man who had spent years questioning every assumption about fighting. A man who didn't care how a technique looked. A man who cared whether it worked. A man who would abandon his own favorite technique if he discovered something better. And now, that man was standing directly in front of him. The cameras were ready. The coliseum stood around them like a monument from another age. The ancient walls watched silently. Bruce looked across the arena. Chuck looked back. For a few seconds, neither man moved. Then Bruce stepped forward. Chuck did the same. The distance between them disappeared. The cameras began rolling, and the world was about to witness what would become one of the most unforgettable martial arts confrontations ever put on film. But what the audience wouldn't know was that the fight wasn't really about proving who was stronger. It was about something much deeper. Power against precision, strength against speed, tradition against adaptation, and at the center of it all was Bruce Lee. The man Chuck Norris had already recognized long before the rest of the world understood him. The man who wasn't satisfied with being called a kung fu master. Because Bruce wasn't trying to become the greatest practitioner of one style. He was trying to become something much harder to define, a fighter without limitations. And now, inside the Coliseum, Chuck Norris was about to find out just how far Bruce Lee's philosophy could really go. The cameras started. Bruce raised his guard. Chuck stepped forward. And the next few minutes would turn their names into legend. Cameras were rolling. The ancient Coliseum surrounded them. Bruce Lee stood several feet away from Chuck Norris. Neither man smiled. There was no playful Hollywood energy, no sense that this was merely another scene. For a moment, it looked as if the entire arena had stopped breathing. Then Chuck moved. Fast. Bruce reacted, and suddenly, the space between them disappeared. The fight had begun. Chuck Norris came forward with power. His movements were controlled, heavy, precise. Every strike carried the experience of a man who had spent years competing at the highest level. Bruce didn't meet that power head-on. He moved. One step, a shift, a sudden change of angle, then another. Chuck attacked again. Bruce slipped away. The difference was obvious. Chuck was trying to impose his strength. Bruce was trying to control the distance, and that distinction was about to become everything. Chuck pressed forward. Bruce gave ground. For a moment, Bruce appeared to be losing. Then Chuck attacked again. Bruce reacted. And suddenly the rhythm changed. The man who had been retreating was now studying, watching, learning. And Chuck realized something. Bruce wasn't simply fighting him. He was reading him. Every fighter has a rhythm, a tiny pattern hidden inside every movement, a certain way of stepping, a certain moment before attacking, a certain reaction after missing. Most people never notice these details. Bruce did. He watched Chuck's shoulders, his feet, his balance, his breathing, his timing. He wasn't looking at the punch. He was looking at everything that happened before the punch. That was the difference. Because if you wait until the fist is already moving, you may already be too late. Bruce wanted to recognize the intention before the attack became obvious, and once he saw it, he intercepted. That idea was at the heart of his philosophy. Don't chase the attack. Don't wait for the opponent to finish. Meet the movement at the moment it begins. Intercept. Chuck attacked. Bruce countered. Chuck changed his approach. Bruce changed with him. The sequence continued, and something extraordinary began happening. The longer the fight lasted, the more Bruce seemed to understand. He wasn't becoming tired of the fight. He was becoming more familiar with it. That was what made him dangerous. Bruce could adapt, and Chuck knew exactly how valuable that ability was, because Chuck wasn't facing someone who had memorized a sequence. He was facing someone who could abandon the sequence entirely. If the situation changed, Bruce changed. If Chuck changed, Bruce changed again. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. Every time you thought you had it, It slipped somewhere else. But then Chuck found an opening. He attacked hard. Bruce went down. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The man who seemed almost impossible to touch was suddenly on the ground. The scene had changed. Chuck stood over him. Bruce remained still. For anyone watching, it looked like the fight might be over, but Chuck knew better. And then Bruce moved. Slowly at first. He got back onto his feet. He looked at Chuck. No panic, no anger, no embarrassment, just concentration. He had learned something. And that was the moment the fight changed. Bruce had been given new information. Now he would use it. Bruce attacked again, but this time, his movements were different, sharper, more direct, less wasted motion. Chuck defended. Bruce moved around him. Chuck countered. Bruce adjusted. The speed increased. And now the difference between the two men became impossible to ignore. Chuck had power. Bruce had timing. Chuck had experience. Bruce had adaptability. Chuck could deliver tremendous force. Bruce could make a fraction of a second disappear. And in fighting, a fraction of a second can be everything. Bruce suddenly accelerated. A strike came forward. Chuck responded. Another. Chuck blocked. Bruce changed direction. Another movement. Another adjustment. The rhythm became faster, faster, faster. And now the scene looked almost unreal. But there was something underneath all that speed. Bruce wasn't moving randomly. Every movement had a purpose. Every step reduced distance. Every angle created another possibility. Every reaction from Chuck gave Bruce more information. That was the real Bruce Lee. Not the theatrical Bruce Lee, not the screaming movie icon, the thinking fighter. And then Chuck saw it. The thing that made Bruce different. Bruce wasn't trying to become perfect. He was trying to become free. Free from unnecessary movements. Free from rigid patterns. Free from the idea that one style had to contain every answer. Free from the belief that a martial artist had to fight exactly the way his school taught him. Bruce wanted the freedom to use whatever worked, whenever it worked, however it worked. And Chuck understood the significance. This wasn't simply another martial arts philosophy. It was a different way of looking at combat itself. Bruce wasn't asking, which style am I using? He was asking, what does this moment require? That was the question. And once Bruce understood the moment, he responded. The fight continued. Chuck pressed forward. Bruce retreated. Then, suddenly, Bruce stopped retreating. He stepped in. A burst of movement, a counter. Chuck reacted. Bruce was already somewhere else. The audience could barely follow. But Chuck could. He was close enough to feel the difference. He knew the speed wasn't an illusion. He knew the precision wasn't a camera trick. And he knew something else. Bruce wasn't moving that way because the movie demanded it. He had trained his body to respond that way. Years of repetition had turned ideas into instinct. And now, the world was finally seeing the result. There was a moment during the fight when Bruce seemed completely exhausted. His breathing was heavier. His body was covered in sweat. Chuck was still standing. The fight looked brutally physical. But Bruce didn't stop. He kept moving. Because he understood something simple. Fatigue reveals your habits. When you're fresh, you can think. When you're exhausted, you fall back on what you've built. That was why Bruce trained so relentlessly. He didn't want his technique to exist only when everything was perfect. He wanted it to remain when everything was falling apart, when the body was tired, when the mind was under pressure, when fear entered the equation, when the opponent refused to cooperate. That was when training mattered most. And Chuck knew it. Then Bruce made his final adjustment. He watched Chuck carefully. 1 second, 2, 3. And then he moved. A sudden attack. Chuck defended. Bruce changed angle. Another attack. Chuck responded. Bruce kept going. No hesitation, no unnecessary movement, just instinct, timing, adaptation, and finally, the balance of the fight shifted completely. Chuck was no longer controlling the pace. Bruce was. But the most important part wasn't the physical victory. It was what happened between the two men afterward. Because when the scene ended, there was no hatred, no humiliation, no ego. There was respect, deep respect. the kind only fighters truly understand. The cameras stopped. The tension disappeared. The men looked at each other, and for a moment, neither said anything. They didn't need to. They had just experienced something most people never experience. They had tested one another, not as movie stars, not as celebrities, but as martial artists. And Chuck had seen what he needed to see. Bruce Lee wasn't simply fast. He wasn't simply strong. He wasn't simply talented. He had built something inside himself that was much harder to defeat. Adaptability. That was the weapon. The world would eventually watch the finished film. Millions would see Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris facing each other inside the coliseum. They would remember the kicks, the punches, the speed, the dramatic ending. But they wouldn't see the years behind it. They wouldn't see Bruce training alone. They wouldn't see him questioning techniques. They wouldn't see him throwing away movements he considered unnecessary. They wouldn't see the endless repetitions. They wouldn't see the failures. They wouldn't see the obsession. Chuck Norris had. And that was why Chuck's respect for Bruce went far beyond what the audience could understand. He had seen the work behind the legend. But there was still something about Bruce that Chuck had not completely understood. Something even deeper. Bruce didn't want people to copy him. He didn't want millions of students simply repeating his movements. He wanted them to think. That was the point. Don't become Bruce Lee. Become yourself. Take what works. Question what doesn't. Study. Adapt. Grow. Bruce believed that a person should be like water, flexible, responsive, impossible to trap inside one shape, and that philosophy extended far beyond fighting. It was a philosophy about life. The world would later remember Bruce Lee for his martial arts, but his greatest lesson wasn't a punch, it wasn't a kick, it wasn't a fighting technique. It was the idea that limitations should be questioned, even your own, especially your own. Chuck Norris had walked into that encounter knowing he was facing an exceptional martial artist. He walked away understanding something else. Bruce Lee wasn't simply mastering techniques, he was mastering the ability to change, and that made him different. Because techniques can be copied, speed can be trained, strength can be developed, but the ability to recognize what needs to change and then actually change it requires something much deeper. It requires humility, discipline, intelligence, and courage. Bruce had all four. Years later, the world would continue turning Bruce Lee into a legend. Posters, movies, books, interviews, thousands of imitators, millions of fans. But Chuck Norris remembered the man before the legend, the man who kept training, the man who kept questioning, the man who refused to accept that yesterday's answer had to remain tomorrow's answer. And perhaps that was why Chuck understood Bruce better than most, because he knew what the audience didn't. The Bruce Lee people saw on the screen was only the surface. Behind that image was a man who had spent years fighting something far more difficult than another opponent. He was fighting his own limitations every single day, and he was winning, one limitation at a time. But there was one final question. If Bruce Lee wasn't really defined by kung fu, if he wasn't defined by karate, if he wasn't defined by boxing, if he wasn't defined by any single martial art, then what exactly was he? Chuck Norris had an answer, and it wasn't master. It wasn't movie star. It wasn't even martial artist. The answer was much simpler. Fighter. A fighter who refused to stop learning. A fighter who refused to become trapped. A fighter who understood that the greatest weapon wasn't a particular technique, but the ability to adapt when everything changed. And that was the truth Chuck Norris had discovered. But there was still one final lesson Bruce wanted the world to understand. A lesson that had nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with becoming stronger than the person you were yesterday. Because the greatest opponent Bruce Lee ever faced wasn't Chuck Norris. It wasn't another martial artist. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't fame. It was Bruce Lee himself. And in the final chapter, we'll discover why Chuck Norris believed that was the real secret behind the legend. The world remembers the fight, the coliseum, the sweat, the speed, the punches, the final moments between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. But Chuck Norris remembered something else. He remembered what happened before the camera started. And more importantly, he remembered the man Bruce Lee was when nobody was watching. That was the Bruce Lee most people never knew, and perhaps that was the most important Bruce Lee of all. When the world watched Bruce Lee, they saw confidence. They saw a man who seemed almost impossible to intimidate, but behind that confidence was something far more powerful. Self-doubt, not the kind that destroys a person, the kind that forces a person to improve. Bruce questioned himself constantly. Could he move faster? Could he become more precise? Could he eliminate another unnecessary movement? Could he understand his opponent more quickly? Could he become more efficient? He never seemed satisfied with the answer, and that was precisely why he kept growing. While others were trying to prove they were already great, Bruce was still trying to become better. That difference was enormous. Chuck Norris understood this because he had lived inside the same world. He knew what competition did to a person. He knew what pressure felt like. He knew how difficult it was to stand in front of another highly trained fighter and remain calm. But Bruce approached the problem differently. He wasn't trying to defeat everyone. He was trying to understand the conditions under which fighting worked. And then he wanted to remove everything unnecessary. That was why Bruce could look at a technique practiced for generations and ask, but does it actually work? It was a dangerous question. Because once you start questioning everything, you can't always go back. And Bruce didn't want to go back. He wanted freedom. Freedom from rigid systems, freedom from unnecessary rules, freedom from the belief that there was only one correct way to move, and that idea became one of the foundations of his Jeet Kune Do philosophy. Bruce believed a martial artist should be able to adapt, not imitate, not blindly follow, adapt. Because the opponent changes, the environment changes, the distance changes, the timing changes, your body changes, your circumstances change. So why should your response remain exactly the same? That was Bruce's answer. It shouldn't. This was what Chuck Norris saw. Bruce wasn't collecting martial arts styles. He was extracting their useful ideas. Boxing gave him certain tools. Fencing gave him others. Karate offered others. Kung Fu offered others. Bruce studied them, tested them, modified them, and then made them his own. That was why labeling him simply as a Kung Fu master never completely captured what he was. Bruce Lee had gone beyond the label. He wasn't interested in belonging to one box. He wanted to understand what happened outside the box, and that mentality eventually reached far beyond martial arts. Bruce once challenged people to think about water. Water has no fixed shape. Put it in a cup, it becomes the cup. Put it in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. It can be gentle, it can be powerful, it can move around obstacles instead of fighting them directly. That idea represented Bruce's philosophy perfectly. Be adaptable. Don't become trapped by one identity. Don't assume yesterday's answer must work tomorrow. Don't let tradition become an excuse for refusing to evolve. And don't let your own success become a prison. Because sometimes, the thing that stops a person from improving isn't failure. It's success. Once people become successful, they become attached to what made them successful. Bruce tried to avoid that trap. Even when the world started calling him a master, he continued behaving like a student. And then came fame. The movies became bigger. The audiences became larger. Bruce Lee became internationally recognizable. People began copying his hairstyle, his movements, his expressions, his training methods, his famous poses. Millions wanted to look like Bruce Lee. But Bruce wanted something completely different. He wanted people to think like Bruce Lee. Not literally, not by copying his personality, but by questioning themselves, by discovering what worked for them, by refusing to blindly accept limitations. That was the real message. Bruce wasn't saying, "Fight like me." He was saying, "Find your own way." Chuck Norris understood the difference, and perhaps that was why his respect for Bruce went so deep. Because Chuck knew how difficult it was to reach the level Bruce had reached, not physically, mentally. Bruce had the courage to abandon ideas that no longer served him. That's harder than it sounds. Imagine spending years mastering a technique, only to realize it doesn't fit the person you've become. Most people keep it, they protect it, they defend it. Bruce would throw it away because Bruce valued effectiveness over ego, and that required humility, real humility. Think about what that means. A man becomes famous. People begin calling him a master. Millions admire him. And instead of believing he has finally arrived, he keeps asking, "What am I still missing?" That was Bruce. And that question may have been his greatest weapon, because the moment you believe you know everything, you stop learning. Bruce never wanted to stop learning. Not in martial arts, not in fitness, not in philosophy, not in acting, not in life. He was constantly searching, constantly experimenting, constantly pushing, and Chuck Norris saw that process from close range. That's why Chuck didn't simply see Bruce as talented. He saw him as committed. And commitment is much harder to defeat than talent. The famous Coliseum fight eventually became legendary. People analyzed every movement, every strike, every reaction, every moment. But the scene meant something different to Chuck. For him, it represented a meeting between two serious martial artists who understood the work behind what the audience was seeing. Chuck knew the fight had been created for cinema, but the respect between the two men wasn't fiction. That part was real. Bruce respected Chuck. Chuck respected Bruce. And that respect mattered, because true fighters don't need to pretend their opponent is weak. They respect strength, they study it, they learn from it, and then they improve themselves. Bruce's life would ultimately be far shorter than anyone expected. He would leave the world decades before many of his fans imagined. But something strange happened after his death. The legend became larger. His influence spread. New generations discovered him. Martial artists studied his philosophy. Actors studied his screen presence. Athletes studied his discipline. Ordinary people found inspiration in his words. And Bruce Lee became more than a martial artist. He became a symbol of transformation, of discipline, of freedom, of refusing to accept the limits other people place on you. But Chuck Norris knew the symbol had begun with a real person. A person who sweated, a person who struggled, a person who made mistakes, a person who got tired, a person who questioned himself, and then trained again. That's what makes the story so powerful. Bruce Lee wasn't superhuman. He became extraordinary because he refused to stop working on himself. He wasn't born with unlimited ability. He built ability. He didn't wake up one morning as a legend. He created the legend through thousands of ordinary days that nobody saw. One repetition, then another. One adjustment, then another. One failure, then another attempt. And eventually, the world saw the result. But the world saw the result. Chuck Norris saw the process, and that is why his understanding of Bruce was different. There is a lesson hidden inside that. Most people look at greatness from the outside. They see the final product, the champion, the celebrity, the successful person. They see the moment when everyone applauds. But they don't see the years when nobody cared. They don't see the boring repetitions. They don't see the mistakes. They don't see the uncertainty. They don't see the days when quitting would have been easier. Bruce Lee understood that, and he embraced it. He trained when nobody was watching. He studied when nobody was applauding. He questioned himself when everyone else was calling him exceptional. That was the secret. Not magic, not a hidden technique, not some mysterious martial arts power, work, adaptation, discipline, curiosity, and an almost obsessive refusal to remain the same person. So why did Chuck Norris respect Bruce Lee so much? Because Chuck knew something the average viewer didn't. Bruce Lee's greatest strength wasn't his punch. It wasn't his kick. It wasn't even his speed. His greatest strength was his willingness to change. When something didn't work, he changed it. When something could be improved, he improved it. When he discovered a weakness, he attacked it. And when the world finally placed him on a pedestal, he kept looking for another mountain to climb. That is what made Bruce Lee different. The cameras fade. The coliseum disappears. The crowd disappears. The fame disappears. And we're left with a much simpler image, a young Bruce Lee, alone, training, no audience, no applause, just the sound of his breathing, his feet moving across the floor, his fists cutting through the air, again, again, again. He stops, looks at his reflection. For a moment, he says nothing. Then he starts again. Because tomorrow, he wants to be better than he was today. And maybe that's why Bruce Lee's legacy survived. Not because he taught people how to throw the fastest punch, not because he became a Hollywood icon, not because he defeated fictional opponents on a movie screen, but because he represented something much bigger. The idea that you don't have to remain the person you were yesterday. You can question yourself. You can change. You can learn. You can start again. You can abandon what no longer works. You can become stronger, not because someone gave you permission, but because you decided you weren't finished. Chuck Norris saw that man before the fame, before the worldwide recognition, before Bruce Lee became a legend. He saw the fighter, the thinker, the student, the perfectionist, the man who refused to stop asking questions. And perhaps that's why the title of Kung Fu Master was never enough, because Bruce Lee didn't belong to one style. He belonged to a much bigger idea: freedom. Freedom to learn, freedom to adapt, freedom to change, freedom to become something greater than the person you were before. The world saw a movie star. Chuck Norris saw a fighter. But perhaps even that isn't enough, because Bruce Lee wasn't simply a fighter. He was a man constantly fighting the limits of his own potential. And that was the opponent he never stopped challenging. Not Chuck Norris, not another martial artist, not Hollywood, not fame, himself. And every morning he stepped into that training room, he fought the same opponent again, yesterday's Bruce Lee. And every night he tried to leave that room as someone slightly better. That may be the greatest truth Chuck Norris ever understood about him. Bruce Lee's real victory wasn't over another man. It was over the version of himself that refused to grow. And that is why, decades after his death, the world still remembers his name, because legends aren't created when everyone starts watching. Legends are created long before that, when nobody is watching at all.